The call came on a cloudy afternoon, and from the moment I opened Marcus Fiesel's case file, I knew this one would stay with me. His photo was at the top of the page, a 3-year-old boy with unruly brown curls and wide, searching eyes. The notes were sparse but telling: autistic, non-verbal, active. They painted a picture of a child who lived in his own world, one that was now colliding with a reality he could barely understand. The initial report described Marcus as a vibrant child who loved flowers, blowing bubbles, and watching Bob the Builder. But alongside those bright details were the dark realities of his home life. His mother, Donna, struggled with mental health issues and substance abuse. Their Middletown home was no sanctuary. Police had responded to domestic disturbances there multiple times. Neighbors frequently reported Marcus wandering the streets, often barefoot, a lone figure against the chaos. When I visited Donna's house for the first time, the scene was worse than I imagined. The air was thick with the acrid smell of waste and mildew. Fleas darted along the floor, and clothes were piled high in every corner. Donna sat on the couch, holding Marcus in her lap. She looked exhausted, her face pale and lined far beyond her years. "I love him," she told me, her voice trembling. "But I can't keep up with him anymore." Marcus squirmed in her arms, a whirlwind of energy. He clutched at the edges of her shirt, reaching for a toy on the floor with his free hand. Donna's tears streaked her face as she described her struggles: Marcus's boundless energy, her own failing health, the violence that had defined her relationships. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "It's just too much." Reports from neighbors and police officers filled in the rest of the story. Marcus had climbed out of a second-story window in January, falling from the roof and requiring stitches for a gash on his chin. Just months later, he was found wandering into traffic, barely avoiding disaster. When officers noted bruises on his small body, the tipping point was reached. Donna's pleas for help came too late. On April 22, 2006, Marcus was removed from Donna's care. That moment is etched in my memory, Marcus screaming, his tiny arms outstretched for his mother as the caseworker carried him to the car. Donna stood frozen in the doorway, her face a mask of anguish. When the car door shut, the sound felt like a verdict, one that neither of them wanted but both of them needed. Marcus was placed with a temporary foster family, a kind couple who tried to help him adjust. They described him as lively, sometimes difficult, but full of wonder. He loved the flowers in their garden, running through rows of daisies and tulips with uninhibited joy. But the placement wasn't permanent. Marcus needed stability, a family that could handle his needs long term. That's when the Carrolls entered the picture. Liz and David Carroll seemed perfect on paper. They were certified foster parents with biological children and glowing reviews from the agency. Their suburban home in Clermont County was clean and orderly, far removed from the chaos Marcus had known. Liz greeted us warmly during the interview. "We'd love to have him," she said, smiling. "He'll be part of our family." David Carroll was quieter, nodding along as Liz spoke. He seemed less engaged but no less committed. Together they presented an image of stability and care, the kind of environment Marcus desperately needed. On May 5th, Marcus was transferred to their home. I remember watching him sit in the back seat of the car, clutching a small toy, a plastic figure of Bob the Builder. He didn't say a word during the drive, his eyes fixed on the scenery outside. When we arrived, Liz knelt down to his level, her smile wide and welcoming. "Hi, Marcus," she said softly. "We're so glad you're here." Marcus didn't respond. He just held onto his toy, his knuckles white with the effort. As the car pulled away from the Carrolls' house, I allowed myself a moment of relief. For the first time in months, it felt like Marcus might have a chance. The Carrolls seemed like the perfect fit, experienced, caring, and willing to embrace the challenges he brought. I thought we'd found him a home. Looking back, I see how wrong we were. The signs were there, hidden beneath the polished surface of their lives. We just didn't see them in time. The Carrolls' home in Clermont County appeared unremarkable, a quiet suburban house with a well-kept yard and a clean driveway. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find children playing in the front yard, not a house that would later become infamous for its darkness. On the surface, Liz and David Carroll seemed like ideal foster parents. They'd passed all the background checks, fostered children before, and had biological kids of their own. But appearances can be deceiving. The first few weeks after Marcus moved into their home, there were no immediate red flags. Liz continued her routine of submitting reports to the foster agency. noting Marcus's difficulties adjusting but framing them in a way that sounded manageable. "He's a handful," she admitted during a follow-up visit, "but we're working on it." On paper, it seemed like Marcus was beginning to settle into his new life. But the truth was far more sinister. Behind the Carrolls' polished facades, Marcus's world was unraveling. The Carrolls quickly grew frustrated with his energy, his inability to sit still, and his constant need for attention. To Liz and David, Marcus wasn't a child in need of love, he was a disruption. And disruptions were not tolerated in the Carroll household. Amy Baker, a close friend of the Carrolls, was a near constant presence in their home. Her role was ambiguous, part nanny, part confidante, and, some would later claim, part of a twisted romantic triangle involving Liz and David. The dynamic between the three adults was tense, a brewing storm of jealousy and resentment. Amy was particularly close to David, and rumors swirled that their relationship went far beyond friendship. Liz seemed either oblivious to or complicit in the arrangement, creating an environment charged with secrecy and dysfunction. Marcus's presence in this toxic household only exacerbated the tension. He was viewed as an inconvenience, a burden that disrupted the carefully constructed balance of their lives. It didn't take long for their frustrations to turn into cruelty. The first indications of trouble were subtle. A caseworker visiting the Carroll home noted that Marcus seemed withdrawn, quieter than expected for a child described as energetic and active. Liz dismissed it, saying he was just adjusting. "He's still getting used to us," she said with a practiced smile. The caseworker accepted her explanation and left, unaware of the reality behind the closed doors. In truth, Marcus was being subjected to escalating neglect and abuse. The Carrolls began confining him to his room for hours on end, isolating him from the rest of the household. When he wouldn't sit still, they restrained him with duct tape, wrapping his small body in blankets to keep him from moving. The reports that later surfaced described scenes of horrifying cruelty. Marcus left alone, unable to free himself, while the Carrolls went about their lives as though he didn't exist. Amy Baker played a key role in these acts of abuse. Witnesses would later describe her as cold and detached, following Liz and David's lead without hesitation. Together, the three adults treated Marcus not as a child, but as a problem to be managed. Each act of cruelty seemed calculated, designed to strip him of his voice, his energy, and eventually his humanity. The Carrolls' other children, meanwhile, were spared from this treatment. They were fed, clothed, and cared for, living what appeared to be a normal life. The contrast was stark, a chilling reminder of how deliberately Marcus was being singled out. To the outside world, the Carroll home seemed like any other. Inside, it was a house of secrets, its walls hiding unspeakable acts. What's most haunting is how long it went unnoticed. The Carrolls were careful, ensuring that no one outside their home saw what was happening. They maintained the image of dutiful foster parents, fulfilling their obligations just enough to avoid suspicion. The foster agency conducted routine visits, but those visits were brief and surface level. No one looked too closely, and no one asked the right questions. For Marcus, the days stretched into weeks, each one more isolating than the last. His world grew smaller, confined to the walls of his room and the tight embrace of duct tape and blankets. He cried out, but there was no one there to hear him. It wasn't until later, when the full extent of the Carrolls' actions came to light, that we understood the true depth of their depravity. By then, it was too late. Marcus's fate had already been sealed, hidden behind the doors of a house that no one thought to question. It was the kind of summer day that should have been filled with laughter, the kind of day children remember for running through sprinklers and playing in the sun. But for Marcus Fiesel, August 4, 2006, was the day his life was brutally stolen. The Carrolls were preparing for a family reunion in Kentucky. It was meant to be a weekend of celebration, but Marcus wasn't part of their plans. To them, he wasn't family, he was a problem. Liz and David Carroll, along with Amy Baker, devised a horrifying solution. They would leave Marcus behind, confined and helpless, while they attended the gathering. That morning, the house was eerily quiet. Marcus was already subdued, his energy sapped by weeks of isolation and neglect. Liz and Amy wrapped him tightly in a blanket, binding him from neck to ankles. Duct tape was wound around the blanket, ensuring he couldn't move. It wasn't enough for them to restrain him. They stripped him of even the slightest ability to adjust his position or breathe freely. David Carroll carried Marcus to a playpen, shoving the bound child inside. They placed him in a closet, locking the door and cutting off any air circulation. The air conditioners in the house were turned off, leaving the interior stifling. Outside, the temperature climbed into the triple digits. Inside that closet, it would have been even hotter, suffocatingly so. No water, no food, no ventilation. The Carrolls locked the house and left for Kentucky, bringing their biological children and even the family dog. They ensured everyone else in the household would be cared for, everyone except Marcus. They were fully aware of what they were doing. This wasn't neglect born of ignorance or oversight. It was calculated, deliberate. They left Marcus to die. For nearly 48 hours, Marcus endured unimaginable suffering. Bound so tightly he could barely breathe, he had no means to call for help, no one to hear his cries. The closet became his tomb. By the time the Carrolls returned on the morning of August 6th, the heat had done its work. Marcus was gone. When they opened the closet door, they found his lifeless body. His face was pale, his small frame unnaturally still. For any normal person, the sight of a child's body helpless and bound, stolen by their own actions, would have elicited horror. But Liz, David, and Amy didn't react with grief or remorse. Instead, they moved into damage control. Marcus's death wasn't a tragedy to them, it was an inconvenience. David Carroll took charge of the cleanup. He wrapped Marcus's body in another blanket, placing it in a cardboard box along with some clothing to conceal the remains. He and Amy Baker loaded the box into a car and drove to a secluded area in Brown County, Ohio. They chose the location carefully, far enough from their home that no one would associate it with them. At the site, they retrieved a portable chimney they'd brought along, its metal frame darkened by soot from previous use. They doused Marcus's body in gasoline and set it alight. As the flames consumed his small frame, the two stood by, watching to ensure that no trace would remain. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning flesh, but to them, it was just a necessary part of their plan. Once the fire burned itself out, David and Amy gathered what remained: ashes, charred fragments of bone, and disposed of them in the Ohio River. The current carried the evidence away, scattering Marcus's remains into oblivion. The act was calculated, cold, and efficient. In their minds, Marcus was gone, erased from existence. But the Carrolls weren't done. They knew they needed a story to explain Marcus's absence. Liz Carroll took the lead, weaving a narrative that painted her as a distraught mother whose foster child had vanished under tragic circumstances. On August 15th, she took her children to a park in Hamilton County. There, she staged an elaborate scene. Lying on the ground, she pretended to faint, claiming later that she'd blacked out due to low blood pressure. When she came to, she told bystanders that Marcus, who had supposedly been with her at the park, was gone. The story sparked a massive search effort. Law enforcement and community volunteers scoured the area, desperate to find Marcus. Flyers were printed, search dogs brought in, and officers canvassed the neighborhood. Liz played her part well, appearing on local news stations to plead for his safe return. "Marcus is my son," she said, her voice trembling. "Please bring him back." Behind the scenes, law enforcement was growing skeptical. Stranger abductions are rare, and the timing of Liz's supposed fainting spell seemed suspicious. Prosecutors began dissecting the Carrolls story, probing for inconsistencies. When asked about the last time anyone had seen Marcus alive, the answers were vague. The Carrolls had made one crucial mistake: they underestimated the determination of those seeking the truth. The search for Marcus became a search for answers, and as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the Carrolls' carefully constructed lie began to unravel. The Carrolls' staged disappearance of Marcus Fiesel was unraveling. To the public, Liz Carroll appeared to be a grieving foster mother, desperate for the safe return of her missing son. But to law enforcement, her story reeked of fabrication. Something about the timing of her fainting spell at the park, coupled with Marcus's disappearance, seemed far too convenient. Hamilton County prosecutors, led by Joe Dieters, were immediately skeptical. Stranger kidnappings were exceedingly rare, especially in broad daylight. When was the last time anyone actually saw Marcus alive? Dieters asked investigators during a strategy meeting. The question hit like a hammer. The last verified sighting had been over a week earlier, before the Carrolls family reunion in Kentucky. That timeline didn't sit right with Dieters. If Marcus had truly been missing for that long, why had no one noticed? Investigators turned their attention to the Carrolls' extended family, questioning those who had attended the reunion. It didn't take long for cracks in the story to emerge. Witnesses reported that Marcus had not been with the Carrolls during the trip. In fact, no one could recall seeing him at all. That revelation shifted the investigation into high gear. The turning point came when subpoenas were issued to Liz Carroll and Amy Baker, compelling them to testify before a grand jury. Amy, who had been deeply involved in the Carroll household and their increasingly suspicious behavior, was brought in first. At the outset, she stuck to the fabricated story. But as investigators pressed her, the cracks widened. Prosecutors warned Amy that lying to the grand jury would carry severe consequences. For hours, she resisted, insisting that Marcus had been with Liz at the park. But her resolve began to waver under the weight of her guilt. Finally, she asked to speak with her public defender. When she emerged, her demeanor had shifted. She was pale, visibly shaken. The truth she had been holding back was about to spill out. Amy's confession was devastating. She admitted that Marcus had never gone to the park that day. Instead, she described in horrifying detail how he had been left bound and alone in the Carrolls' closet while the family attended the reunion. Her voice trembled as she recounted the makeshift restraints, the stifling heat, and the cruel indifference with which they had left him to die. But Amy's revelations didn't stop there. She went on to explain how she and David Carroll had disposed of Marcus's body. She told investigators about the portable chimney, the gasoline, and the secluded site in Brown County where they had burned his remains. She described watching as David scattered Marcus's ashes in the Ohio River, ensuring that no trace of him would remain. With Amy's confession in hand, investigators moved swiftly. They located the burn site, combing through the area for evidence. Among the ashes and debris, they found fragments of bone-small, charred pieces that confirmed Amy's story. The portable chimney was dismantled and taken into evidence, its darkened interior a haunting testament to what had occurred. Liz Carroll, meanwhile, continued to maintain her innocence. She held a press conference, tearfully pleading for the public's help in finding Marcus. "I was at the park with him," she insisted, her voice trembling. "He's my son. I just want him back." Her performance was convincing enough to garner sympathy from some, but to law enforcement, it was nothing more than a calculated lie. Prosecutors knew they had to act quickly. On August 28, 2006, Liz Carroll was arrested and charged with felony murder, involuntary manslaughter, kidnapping, and child endangerment. David Carroll was also arrested, facing similar charges, including abuse of a corpse for his role in disposing of Marcus's remains. The community's shock quickly turned to outrage as the details of the case came to light. The idea that Marcus had been left to die while his foster family attended a reunion, that his body had been burned and discarded like garbage, was almost too horrifying to comprehend. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, demanding justice for Marcus. His biological mother, Donna, was inconsolable. "I trusted them to take care of him," she said through tears. "They were supposed to protect him." Amy Baker's role in the case became a point of contention. While her testimony was crucial to unraveling the Carrolls' lies, her active participation in the cover-up could not be ignored. Yet prosecutors struck a deal with her, granting her immunity in exchange for her cooperation. It was a controversial decision, but one they believed was necessary to ensure convictions for Liz and David Carroll. As the case moved toward trial, the weight of what had happened began to settle over everyone involved. The Carrolls' lies had unraveled, their secrets laid bare. But the cost of uncovering the truth was almost too great to bear. Marcus's life had been stolen, not just by the actions of Liz, David, and Amy, but by a system that had failed to protect him at every turn. The courtroom was packed as the trial of Liz Carroll began in early 2007. The air inside was heavy with anticipation, a mixture of outrage and grief that permeated every corner of the space. At the center of it all was Marcus Fiesel, a boy whose life had been stolen long before he had a chance to truly live it. Liz Carroll sat stoically at the defense table, her expression cold, betraying no remorse. The prosecution, led by Assistant Prosecutor Daniel Breyer, meticulously laid out the case against her. They detailed the horrifying events of Marcus's final days, painting a vivid picture of the calculated cruelty he endured. Evidence from the burn site, testimony from Amy Baker, and the makeshift restraints used to bind Marcus were all presented in damning clarity. This wasn't neglect, Breyer told the jury during closing arguments. This was deliberate. This was murder. Amy Baker's testimony was the linchpin of the prosecution's case. She recounted, in chilling detail, how Marcus had been left to die in the closet, bound so tightly that he couldn't move or breathe. She described the Carrolls' indifference, their decision to prioritize a family reunion over the life of a child they had sworn to protect. Her words were blunt and unflinching, leaving little room for doubt about what had occurred. The physical evidence was equally devastating. The jury was shown photos of the duct tape and blankets used to restrain Marcus, as well as the portable chimney where his remains were burned. For many in the courtroom, the images were almost too much to bear. One juror wiped away tears as the prosecution described how Marcus's body had been treated with less care than the Carrolls' family dog, who they had taken to the reunion while leaving Marcus behind. The defense attempted to portray Liz Carroll as a victim of circumstance. Her lawyers argued that she had been overwhelmed, coerced by her husband, and struggling with mental health issues that impaired her judgment. They claimed she had been manipulated by David Carroll and Amy Baker, suggesting that she wasn't fully aware of what was happening to Marcus. But the evidence told a different story. The turning point came when Liz took the stand. Her testimony was intended to elicit sympathy, but her demeanor betrayed her. When confronted with the prosecution's evidence, she became defensive, snapping at questions and contradicting herself. At one point, when Breyer emphasized the Carrolls' decision to bring their dog to the reunion while leaving Marcus to die, Liz blurted out, "The dog's alive now, isn't it?" The courtroom fell silent. That single statement encapsulated her complete lack of remorse. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. On every count, felony murder, involuntary manslaughter, kidnapping, and child endangerment, Liz Carroll was found guilty. The judge sentenced her to 54 years to life in prison, ensuring she would never walk free again. David Carroll, who had opted to plead guilty to avoid trial, received a sentence of 15 years to life. He admitted to his role in disposing of Marcus's remains, but tried to shift the blame for the boy's death onto Amy Baker. His attempt to downplay his involvement was met with disdain, both from the court and the public. Amy Baker, despite her central role in the cover-up, walked away without facing any charges. Her immunity deal sparked outrage, with many arguing that she had been just as complicit as the Carrolls. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus and Amy Baker belongs in jail." Still, prosecutors defended their decision, insisting that Baker's testimony had been critical in securing convictions for Liz and David. The impact of Marcus's death extended far beyond the courtroom. His case became a rallying cry for reform in the foster care system, exposing its failures in stark detail. The agency responsible for placing Marcus with the Carrolls, Lifeway for Youth, came under intense scrutiny. An internal investigation revealed significant lapses, including inadequate background checks and insufficient oversight of foster placements. The agency's license was revoked, and it ultimately shut down. In the wake of the tragedy, Ohio implemented new regulations to strengthen protections for foster children. Background checks became more rigorous, home visits more frequent, and training for foster parents more comprehensive. While these changes were a step in the right direction, they came too late for Marcus. For his biological mother, Donna, the grief was unbearable. "I trusted them," she said during an interview. "I thought he'd be safe. I thought he'd have a better life." Her words were a painful reminder of the system's failure to protect Marcus. She would never forgive herself for not being able to keep him safe, even though the circumstances had been far beyond her control. In the years following Marcus's death, his memory became a symbol of resilience and the need for accountability. A memorial bench was placed in a local park in his honor, inscribed with his name and a simple phrase, "Forever loved." The chimney used to burn his remains was dismantled and repurposed as part of a quiet memorial site, a place for reflection and remembrance. The community that had searched tirelessly for Marcus during those harrowing days in August 2006 came together again to ensure that his story would not be forgotten. Candlelight vigils were held, with children releasing bubbles into the sky, one of Marcus's favorite pastimes. It was a bittersweet tribute to a life that had been cut short far too soon. As I reflect on the case, one question continues to haunt me. How did the system fail so completely? Marcus wasn't just let down by the Carrolls, he was let down by all of us. Every missed warning sign, every moment of inaction, paved the way for the tragedy that unfolded. The loss of Marcus Fiesel remains a scar on the collective conscience of everyone involved in his case. But it is also a call to action, a reminder that protecting the most vulnerable among us requires vigilance, compassion, and unwavering accountability. Marcus deserved better. All children do.